Welcome, I'm Kim Balmeno, and today we are looking at Grace Hartigan, historical reference in contemporary masquerade. We're going to look at Grace Hartigan's 1954 painting called Grand Street Brides. As you know, successful artists are not individual geniuses who produce work and avoid text, but are a result of those who came before them, just as they will influence those who come after. I will show the influence that they have on each other and how contemporary culture is embedded in their psyche. I'll do this through Hartigan's 1954 oil painting, Grand Street Brides. Through the lens of critical theory and biography, I'll highlight the fragmentation and otherness of postmodernist theory, yet the whole presentation is coded in semiotics, reference and meaning. 6 brides in a window frame, hands outstretched, 2 sitting and 4 standing, leaning, appeasing. The brides are mannequins, and the shop window is on Grand Street in New York, a street close to the artist Grace Hartigan's studio. Hartigan passed by often and absorbed the trend and the people of Lower Manhattan, who in mid-century New York were mostly Italian immigrants, the marginalized, the other, with whom she could relate as an artist living on the margins of mainstream society herself. The colours of the street vendors and the fruit stalls that sat underneath her window all made an appearance in her art during that decade. Theatre was experimental, poetry was beatnik, and as philosopher Adorno noted, there was a fetishization of reproduction that was commandeered by capitalism. He hated the American culture. He found it conforming and vulgar, just as Hartigan tried to capture that vulgarness and hope in her mannequin brides. Her painting, standing at about 2 meters by 2 meters, encapsulates that era when America was progressing as a global superpower. The post-war depression had ended, as had World War II 8 years earlier. Women had worked during the wartime effort and were now encouraged to be homemakers. Sexual reproduction was topic du jour, and machinery, new cars, and household appliances featured heavily in modern life. And in advertising. The advertisements filled newspapers and magazines. The consumerist society was swelling, and artists began to be recognised for their art, as individual self-realisation was applauded by art critics such as Harold Rosenberg at the time. Magazines were cut up for collages, and Grace Hartigan began to experiment with figurative art in place of her pure abstract expressionism. Hartigan wasn't alone. Other artists who were once part of the New York school, like Nell Blaine, Jane Freilicher, Jane Wilson, Willem de Kooning and his wife Elaine de Kooning, also began incorporating these components into their art. Hartigan's determination to paint on her own terms, however, was paramount. She revisited themes on marriage, strong and mythical women figures, and popular culture throughout her 40-year career as an artist. Life magazine called her the most celebrated female painter in America between the late 1950s and early 1960s, noting that her strokes seemed committed out of rage. The effect is one of extraordinary power. Born in 1922 in Newark, New Jersey, her mother was a member of the Daughters of the Patriots of the American Revolution, ingraining an inherent connection to the America's history. Hartigan married young and had a child by the age of 18. She was twice divorced by the time she painted Grand Street Brides in 1954. She had surrendered her son to his paternal grandparents to pursue her artisan lifestyle and to save him from a life of poverty, which was common among the New York abstract expressionists in the 1940s. They wore it as a badge of honour, remaining pure to the form. In Grand Street Brides, according to biographer Robert Madison, she copied Goya's techniques and based the composition of her mannequins on Goya's painting, Family of Charles IV, 1800. But for me, this painting of the witches, again by Goya, is more apt. There are 6 figures as in Grand Street Brides. Note the yellow-clad woman at bottom centre, and the figure to the bottom right, who is lower in status and clutches her hands out front. These paintings have many similarities. But I would say that the comparison to the family of Charles IV is more of a reference to Goya's use of light and shadow, the handling of fabric, the brilliance in his whites and the melancholy in his blacks that influenced Hartigan in her work. Goya was deeply pessimistic in his later years, had a distaste for corruption, and he painted the royals with an unflattering frankness, which they seem to have accepted. Hartigan's Grand Street Brides is also making a statement about the vulgarity of the consumerist society as America was embarking on a cultural shift. Just as Goya used emotional expression to portray his point of view, so too does Hartigan. We know of another major influence on both Hartigan and Goya, and who is remembered as the painter's painter, as many studied his technique, and that was Francesco Velázquez, 1599 to 1616, who in turn studied Venetian paintings such as Titian for perspective and Dutch Rubens for realism, and in the last decade of his life he painted with a freedom and a truth to nature. His brush strokes are loose, free and luminous. He has used sombre colours, and as you can see with his Infanta Maria Teresa, his use of dramatic facial expression is sharply lit against a plain background, as though her features are reaching from the canvas, demanding your gaze. Can you see the influence of his infant on Hartigan's work? Hartigan uses the same colours and shading. Note the expression on the girl's face to that of Hartigan's girl, situated in the lower right of the painting. This is her homage to the masters, just as I will show you more contemporary artists pay tribute to her. In the meantime, let's go back to Goya and look closely at his pilgrimage to San Isidro beside a close-up of Hartigan's brides. There is anguish. Hartigan's brides are not feeling the same horror and expectations that the pilgrims are, with mouths and eyes agape, but they are making a social pilgrimage of their own. Note the dark tones in the painting. What other similarities can you see? What is the mood? We have already found one character thanks to Velázquez. The face in the bottom right corner could be that of Picasso's portrait of Dora Maar, or Weeping Woman. You can see the similarities in this composition by Picasso to Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, painted in 1939. On the right, you get an idea of the scale of the painting. This would be similar to that of the Grand Street Brides. Many abstract expressionists like to paint in this way to wow the audience with scale, brushstroke and material technique, and to offer an immersive experience of the work. See how Picasso and Hartigan use a flat surface with a two-dimensional perspective, unlike that of Goya and Velázquez, who use diagonals and sides to create perspective, to make their compositions seem three-dimensional and lifelike. Look at the skin tone and posture, the sharp angularity, the hollow eyes and expression. Hartigan's brunette tribute to Picasso even looks Spanish or Italian. Picasso's painting caused a furore when it was first exhibited. The prostitutes from the street Avignon. The girls looked directly at the viewer, turning the male gaze onto itself. A year later, Matisse's Bathers with the Turtle came out with the same blackened face, fashioned after the African mask that Picasso was so fond of. They symbolized the other and fear, just as Les Demoiselles d'Avignon was a response to Matisse's Le Bonheur de Vivre, which came out the year before in 1905 to 1906. Matisse's nudes were curvaceous and their attention diverted. The audience can gaze once again on the naked flesh. Hartigan also diverted her mannequin's eyes to slightly offstage, creating a theatrical effect, as if looking at the painting through a fourth wall and from a slight height, as if we were viewing the scene. To not have the brides looking directly at you renders the viewer as voyeur. We can see the brutality and hope in the expressions of the girls, yet they are unconfrontational. We can gaze for as long as we like. The next slide is a wedding scene by William Hogarth in 1833. want to draw your attention to the luminosity, the light and shadows, and the gaze of the subjects are each respecting the fourth wall also. Hogarth clearly paints with a theatrical vision. He wrote, "I treat my subjects as a dramatic writer. My picture is my stage, and the men and women my players." What does this remind us of 200 years earlier? William Shakespeare's famous soliloquy in As You Like It. "For the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts." Of the mannequin brides on Grand Street. We can see these two figures quite clearly depicted in Hartigan's painting. Notice the shadow, the gesture, the slight tilt of the head, the gaze is outward but vacant. Hartigan used pictures from magazines and live models. She even bought a $5 wedding gown and hung it in her studio for inspiration. She said her themes for Grand Street brides was loneliness, anxiety, and hope. She was making a statement about mass consumption, the growing power of consumerism, and the domestication and the oppression of the woman on becoming a bride. Women had not long before proved themselves as competent and a crucial proletariat during the war effort in helping to establish a nation with growing dominance in global affairs. Identity, representation, and transformation. Hartigan was a fierce and determined woman who, although married 4 times, never played the role of a diminished and conforming housewife. She painted every day and made it clear that her artistry took precedence. She could live the life of an artist. She drank, she swore, she occasionally wore men's clothing and exhibited under the name of George Hartigan until she was convinced to do otherwise in 1953. Michelle Montrellet said, "In order to speak, to represent herself, a woman assumes a masculine position. Perhaps this is why femininity is frequently associated with masquerade." This slide for me represents a woman as incomplete, not whole, oppressed. Eva Hesse painted it in 1960, pointing to Hartigan's earlier work, which we can then reference back to Matisse and Picasso's Black Doll masked face shown earlier, representing other, loss of self and soul, and fear. Because Hartigan used bright colours, and she declared that her work sprang from what was vulgar and vital in modern American life, she was often seen as a precursor for the pop art movement. Although she rejected the movement, she said she would rather be considered a pioneer of a movement she didn't like than referred to as a second-generation artist in one that she did. The second generation made abstract expressionism a usable formal language, the all-over painting, the importance of the surface, and so on. "I can teach," she said, "abstract expressionism, and when you can teach it, it has become academic." It no longer satisfied her creativity. She felt constricted. Yet pop art was not the answer either. She said, "Pop art," and I quote, "Pop art is not like other reactions against abstract expressionism, such as the return to the figure, hard edge, or even Dada, because they were serious attempts to express an opinion, a belief." End quote. Grand Street brides managed to find a middle ground, an expression of time and space that encapsulated mid-century American culture. Michel Foucault said, "The moment of something's greatest perfection is the instant when it emerged, dazzling from the hands of a creator or in the shadowless light of a first morning." But he neglected to mention the slow, messy, chaotic transitions of change. Sometimes it is so insidious that it is not known until hindsight. And although Hartigan was not broadly acknowledged for starting the pop art movement, we cannot deny her influence. The pop artists that came into prominence at around the same time as Hartigan are often called the fathers of pop art, such as Eduardo Palozzi-Bank and Robert Rauschenberg. Yet, you cannot deny their work is influenced by Dada. They also didn't emerge from nowhere, and are obviously making a clear statement in these examples about excessive consumerism of mid-century America and the newfound role of women as domestic goddesses, drowning in machinations that keep them tied to the home. Rauschenberg's statement is a homage to art history. Even Andy Warhol's pop art of the 60s was making a statement. Therefore, Hartigan was wrong to discount pop art as vague. In conclusion, I hope that I have shown you that we all stand on the shoulders of those that came before us, that great artists are not operating within a vacuum of pure originality and genius. We are reminded that postmodern application fractures the discourse of originality into fragments of repetition that allows us to see our reflection in the society in which we live. We are all instrumental in participating in our culture if we allow ourselves to be buoyed into the future by our connections with our past. Art history needs to be replicated because individuals create in a cultural setting that makes pure originality an impossibility. John Burgess says that a people or a class which is cut off by its own past is far less free to choose and to act as a people or a class. I hope you enjoyed Grace Hartigan and a little journey into 1950s women's abstract expressionism. Thank you for joining. Bye.